Hey there, and welcome back to this introduction to India and South Asia. I'm Benjamin Siegel, and today we're going to be going through the rise of civilization on the Indian subcontinent. We're going to cover a tremendous amount of ground today. We're going to move very quickly. We're going to start at around 30,000 years before the Common Era to around 700 in the Common Era. We're going to start with the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, basically prehistoric time on the Indian subcontinent, and we're going to move to the Indus Valley civilization. We'll talk about the Aryan migration and the composition of the Vedas, the advent of two major religious traditions of Buddhism and of Jainism. We'll look at the Maurya Empire and the reign of the famous Emperor Ashoka, and then we're going to end with the Gupta Empire later today. There's a lot of material here, and so to keep things straight, I want to offer one big idea that I want you to use and to think about as you're considering the early history of modern South Asia, but also as we move into the present day. Throughout time, there's been this interplay or a dynamic in South Asian political, economic, and cultural life between these moments of great centralization and then other moments of decentralization. So in other words, there's moments when power has moved into centralized spaces, and then moments when power, and we'll talk about power in lots of different ways, becomes a little more diffuse and has lots of different centers. Right now, this is probably all a little bit abstract, but keep that idea in mind, this idea of centralization and decentralization. And we're going to come back to it a few times over the course of this session and throughout our time together. So let's start right at the beginning. What do we know about prehistoric India? We'll start with Paleolithic India, which is a period of time that we're going to define, as geologists do, as somewhere around 30,000 years before the Common Era to around 10,000 years before the Common Era. This is a moment when if we go to the Indian subcontinent, it's an area that's inhabited primarily by hunter-gatherers, and most densely in the northwest part of the Indian subcontinent. The earliest Paleolithic Indians make their homes mostly in rock shelters, like these in the big site of Bhimbetka in Madhya Pradesh, and sometimes even in caves or other naturally occurring rock outcroppings. Now, when we look at fossils around these sites, we're looking for evidence for what Paleolithic Indians did. And it's pretty easy for us to tell from the fossil record that Indian societies were able to domesticate a good number of animals. There's things like cattle, sheep, and also goats. There's a lot of animals that are wild, even though humans might have somehow had some kind of use for them. So I'm thinking here of members of the big cat family or deer. Most food in this moment is probably acquired by hunting, but also a lot through gathering plants and tubers that grow in the ground. If we look at the tools that Paleolithic Indians had, there's stone tools and there's crude pots, so this is the beginning of some sort of civilization. But beyond that, we don't really know that much. The archaeological record doesn't tell us what languages they spoke, or anything about the religious beliefs they had, the stories that they told one another. This isn't a problem just in South Asia, but it's true around the world. We don't know that much about Paleolithic life. When we move a little bit forward in time into Mesolithic India, we start to see humans assembling together into small settlements. This is a moment in history when in South Asia and across the world, we start to see slightly more complicated stone tools. So things like flakes, blades, burins, points, maybe even if we're reading the archaeological record right, knives and sickles. We think that eventually Mesolithic Indians probably put together hunting tools like bows and arrows. Mesolithic Indians lived away from deep forests and probably mostly on drier uplands. Their settlements were broadly near big rocky outcroppings, and some of them probably still lived like their ancestors did in rock shelters. But we also see in Mesolithic sites a lot of fossilized post holes or little divots in the ground. And if you think for a moment about what that might be, it might become apparent to you what it is. In fact, we get a good sense from those posts that Mesolithic Indians were living in circular huts. They had some kind of social organization, and they were living in some kind of semi-permanent shelter. The record also tells us that Mesolithic Indians probably were eating a little bit better than Paleolithic Indians. They had grain grinders and good pots, so they could probably store food for longer periods of time. And there were lots of different types of animals that they could have relied upon for food. Things like deer, boar, and the now extinct Indian ostrich. We also have a little bit more of a sense of Mesolithic Indian culture. Near a lot of these settlements, there's burials, and many times people there were buried with microliths or little tiny statues. Sometimes they were buried with shells or pendants, and this gives us some kind of sense that there might have been some kind of afterlife, a belief in an afterlife. We see that sometimes people were buried together. They had double burials, but they weren't necessarily men and women, so it's not clear if they were couples or not. India became pretty widely settled in the Mesolithic period. As far south as the Western Ghats, there's engravings from this point in time. And further north, we see slightly better artwork, engravings of ibexes, horns. These are all hints to us that in some ways India might have actually been connected in this period by some distant cultural linkages to the Upper Indus and then beyond into Central Asia. A lot of this is conjecture, but at least in the Mesolithic period, some of the evidence starts to come together. Now, it's in Neolithic India that we really start to get a sense of what's occurring. There's a lot of changes in the Neolithic period, and mostly that comes in the form of the rise of agriculture. In Neolithic India, the population of the Indian subcontinent was getting bigger, and of course there needed to be a predictable source of food. You have to store food for longer periods of time, and so you see at this period the birth of agriculture, and there's important links between humans, animals, and land that are all coming together in this period of time. Now, like in the Near East, like in the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, we have a sense that those practicing agriculture probably lived side by side for a while with humans who were hunting and gathering or doing shifting cultivation or swidden, burning cultivation, before eventually in the Indian subcontinent, like everywhere else in the world, the agriculturalists basically won out. There's good archaeological sites from Neolithic India all across the subcontinent. It's probably the case that Indian agriculturalists moved from place to place and did some kind of light agriculture at first. There's a guess among archaeologists that women were broadly responsible for agricultural work, and that's probably true to an extent, but probably the more intensive agriculture was done by men holding plows by themselves in the absence of any large draft animal that was being used at this time. The plows that we see in this period in Neolithic India are also a big deal. Neolithic India sees a population with tools that are a lot better than before. They've got pottery that's thrown on wheels, which is a lot more sophisticated than hand-formed pottery. There's some fairly intricate ornaments and jewelry. And we know from this and from what we find in pots that there was the cultivation of crops like wheat, barley, rice, and millet. We see in this period that Indians began domesticating animals as well, and of course one of the most important animals that they began to domesticate was cattle, which probably gave them a source of both dairy and meat, two different important sources of protein. One of the biggest and most important sites and well-preserved sites of Neolithic India is called Mergar, and it dates to around 7000 before the Common Era. It's a pretty complex site. There's wheat and there's barley that was growing there, and we see the fossilized remains of sheep and goats. There were mud brick huts with hearths, a granary, and the evidence of pit burials there. There's some pretty good and attractive jewelry there. There's beads made out of turquoise and lapis lazuli, and there's a number of clay figures. All of these are reasonably sophisticated for the Neolithic era, but they pale in comparison to what I'm going to show you right now. Take a look at this object. It's small. It's around 11 centimeters or maybe 4¼ inches. It's made, if you look closely, out of bronze, and it uses the lost wax technique, cire perdu. You make a model and then form copies out of it, so it's probably not the only one. It was found in a house, or what we presume was a house, in the city of Mohenjo-Daro in 1926, so that makes it around 4,500 years old. So who is this person? Is she a dancer? She's got her hip bent a little bit and her legs are forward, so it seems like she could be. She's certainly confident, and so a lot of people think of her as a dancer. We can sort of guess from the bangles that and the posture that whoever made this had a sense of entertainment. There was maybe even a sophisticated dance culture. If you look a little more closely at that jewelry, she's got really heavy rings on her right arm and big bangles on the left arm. She's got a necklace with some pendants, and so we know that the culture that made this had jewelry and precious metals and the ability to work with it at a pretty high level of sophistication. So let's zoom out. In the early 20th century, there's really big British colonial archaeological expeditions that are being undertaken in the Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan. And in 1922, there's an amazing discovery, two really sophisticated ruined cities. One's called Mohenjo-Daro, and the other is called Harappa. And they're the best evidence we have of India's oldest major civilization, and one of the oldest major civilizations in the world, which we've taken to call the Indus Valley Civilization. These two cities date to around 3,000 years before the Common Era, and they look very similar. They're incredibly sophisticated urban spaces. They each have a lower city that doesn't seem to have had walls, but it's divided by major avenues into city blocks. There's a raised mount to the west of each lower city, and there's massive granaries or warehouses that are located next to the old bed where the river used to be. This kind of division actually gives us a lot of great clues into the kinds of lives that the people living there might have lived. If we look at the lower cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, we see that they've got major avenues. They're about 10 meters or 30 feet wide, and they divide the city up into blocks. It almost looks like the grid of Manhattan. We presume that there were brick walls, and that maybe from the evidence that they were decorated with plaster, paint, or even carved timber. There was probably screens in a very hot climate made out of reed and sometimes bamboo. And the houses actually look a lot like some of the houses you might see in certain villages in India or Pakistan today. They've got a big courtyard surrounded by smaller rooms, and each has a space for a night watchman. The amazing thing about these cities is that in these houses, there is very decent indoor plumbing. There's got a well, and there's a toilet, which is not a squat toilet, but it's a toilet with a seat. It looks like the ones that we might use in the West today. The bathrooms all drain via an earthenware pipe that's enclosed in brick into the covered drains which run under the streets. And then on the streets, there's manhole covers. There's also rubbish chutes. These are incredible sewers, and while it seems a little weird to dwell on the plumbing, this is evident that this is one of the most sophisticated early cultures and early cities anywhere in the world. In many ways, these are better than the sewer systems of many cities in modern-day South Asia. To move away from the sewers in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, there's also pretty extensive granaries in both of these cities. In Harappa, there's 2 rows of identical 2-room dwellings, and these are probably the barracks of slaves or indentured servants. And if you go north of the barracks near the granary, there's circular brick milling platforms and the remains of smaller granaries, about 12 in them. We have a sense that what was being ground in them was mostly wheat and barley, and there's really good ventilation in these warehouses that prevented mildew. The interesting thing for our purposes is that these granaries or warehouses were all situated near the old bed of the river. And so if we think about it, that suggests to us that grain was probably brought in as either tax or tribute from different peasant communities by boat. And then it would be stored in granaries for the payment in kind of state servants and the provisioning of the city, and maybe it was ground into meal by the occupants of the barracks there. In other words, this is a really sophisticated social organization. In both of these cities, there are really big and intriguing complexes on the big raised mounds. And in Mohenjo-Daro, there's a really great bath. It's about 2.5 meters deep, and it's made out of bricks. If we go near the bath, there's something that archaeologists call a college, which is a complex of rooms. We're not really sure what that room did, but there is good speculation that it was maybe a college for priests. There's also a big hall, and it looks pretty close to the big audience halls that you might have found in Iran at a similar period. We don't know a whole lot about the Indus civilization's economy, or its technology, or its language or culture, but we've got some clues that we can work with. We know they grew wheat and barley and some millets, but they probably didn't grow rice. There was also at least some cultivation of cotton, probably for garments. There were cattle and sheep and goats, and the camel and the donkey, but they didn't have the horse. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and Indus Valley civilization made use of big bull carts, and those were probably the big means of rural transport. The tools of the Indus people show that they were still using stone, but this was really a Bronze Age society. We see copper arrowheads, knife blades, chisels, saws, fish hooks, and they're made of a wide range of materials. There's mirrors and pins made of copper, cosmetic boxes, beads made of gold, silver, shells, precious and semi-precious stones. One of the interesting things is that some of these materials were unavailable locally. And so we know that Indus Valley civilization had big, robust trade connections with places like Persia, Afghanistan, and Eastern India. There's Indus seals, and we'll talk about this in a second, and other items found as far away as Mesopotamia. So this was a civilization that was trading. So those seals are really the most interesting artifacts and the most mysterious artifacts of Indus civilization. They're mostly small, around 2.5 square centimeters, so they're basically the size of a postage stamp, and you can see some in Boston Museum of Fine Arts and a number of other museums around the world. They've got really beautiful engravings on them, and in many of them there's humped bulls. But in addition to that motif, there's also seals with tigers and elephants, mythic beasts which probably didn't exist, and occasionally a human being. We think that the seals were a sign of ownership. They might actually refer to proper names. They were used to stamp packages, and sometimes you see these signs on pots or bangles, and at least once on a sideboard, so it looks essentially like a billboard today. Each of these seals have short inscriptions on the top, in a script that so far, over the last 100 years, we haven't been able to decipher. We see that there's about 400 signs we've found so far, and so that tells us that the script isn't purely an alphabet, and it's not purely syllabic because no language that we know of has more than about 100 phonemes or different sounds. We're not even really sure what language family they belong to. A really good guess is that they're Dravidian languages, and the languages of what are now southern India. There's pockets of Dravidian languages that are still spoken in the same area in Pakistan. But other archaeologists and linguists have suggested that they were Indo-Sumerian, Elamo-Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, or Australo-Asiatic, basically languages from all around Asia. We do know that they were read from right to left, like Arabic or Hebrew. And we're pretty confident that we may be able to uncover it one day. Our biggest hope is that because the Indus people were seafaring and trading at long distances, that we may find a bilingual inscription that'll help us crack that code, something like the Rosetta Stone. But for the time being, because we can't read the inscriptions, we have a hard time determining anything about religion or social life. There's a big temptation for us, writing from the 21st century, to take modern day or later Hindu interpretations and to graft them on the symbols that we find there, but we've got to be cautious about that. There's a lot of cheap terracotta figures of women wearing necklaces, earrings, sometimes fan-shaped headdresses. We might think that these were votive figures used for worship and maybe even to promote the fertility of crops, livestock, and humans. We think that some of these images might be a local version of a mother cult, and that this image might be a prototype figure of the wife of Shiva. But it might just be a bull, and they could just be children's toys. We really don't know. And if we go to these seals, we can look at them and see strange composite images that are sort of hard to understand. On one seal, there's a man with a horned headdress, maybe three-faced, and he's sitting with the soles of his feet touching, kind of looks like a yoga position. And he's surrounded by two gazelles, a buffalo, a rhinoceros, an elephant, and a tiger. One theory says that this is basically proto-Shiva, the god who later gets called the Lord of Beasts and the Lord of Yogis, and that does seem to kind of make sense when we look at this image. So Indus Valley civilization remains something of a mystery to us. We don't know a lot about its economy, and we don't know a lot about its social organization or its culture. We're not really even sure about how it got started or how it ended. Radiocarbon dating suggests to us that the mature phase of this civilization took place between 2300 and 1700 BCE. So along with the civilizations of the Nile and the Tigris-Euphrates, this is one of the three earliest civilizations of the Old World. We think that the founders of the Indus cities might have come from the Bronze Age peasant cultures found in the hills of Baluchistan. We see some pottery that's similar, and we've discovered that pottery in sites that are about 1,000 years older than the big Indus civilization. So this is probably not an import from somewhere else, but really it's a civilization sprouting up on its own. We do know that these civilizations came to an end by around 1900 BC. City life really comes to an end in southern Asia, and it's going to take until around the 5th century BC before we see major urban civilization again. We don't know whether the civilization ended with a bang or a whimper. Bang theories, the idea that the civilization ended really suddenly, include the idea that Indus civilization was wiped out by a major disaster, so something like a flood, or an earthquake, or a military invasion. And the whimper theories include ideas like an ecological problem, desiccation, the land growing out and becoming infertile, or just stagnation, or a loss of morale in a civilization. Some people look around the Indus Valley sites and they see squatter settlements built from some of the same bricks that were used in the original cities. And there are skeletons left in the streets and in houses unburied. And that can suggest to us that there was some kind of major violence that brought this civilization to an end. But other archaeologists think that the Indus people just wore out their environment. Agriculture stripped the soil and big dust clouds came. We know that the environment in the valley is really different in the 21st century than it was then. There's been substantive climate change over the past millennia, and it was probably a space that was greener, since we see the skeletons of elephants, rhinoceroses, and tigers in the same spot. Now, here's a big irony about Indian history. When we try to put together ideas about the Indus Valley civilization, we have almost no concrete written evidence, but tons of material evidence. But it's the exact opposite with Aryan civilization, which comes afterwards, where we have an incredible trove of religious material and literature called the Vedas, but we have almost no material evidence. So we know much more about the Aryans' religion and their inner lives than we do about their settlements or their economy or their technology. We have the mind, but not really the body of the early Aryans of South Asia. We could spend some time talking here about the big epics of Hindu mythology, mostly the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, because they purport to tell us something about the time after the Indus Valley civilization and before the rise of later empires. There's a lot of great writing and a lot of great presentations on those religious traditions, but they're not going to be our focus here today. We're going to instead think about the oldest literature from South Asia, the Vedas, and then the oldest work of that body called the Rigveda, which is probably written around 1500 to 1200 before the Common Era. The Rigveda is a collection of 1,028 hymns divided into 10 parts, and it's addressed to the different gods. We see lots of different ages and different themes in this work. The central core of this work is probably the private prayers of old priestly families, and there's a later section of hymns dedicated to a god named Soma. And at an even later date, we see the first and last sections of the Rigveda, which are some of the most speculative and philosophical works in early Hindu tradition. It's hard for us to use this as a text to reconstruct social life, since it's mostly a collection of religious hymns. But let's start by discussing what we do know about that religious life. Mostly the Rigveda hymns are addressed to devas. These are shining ones. These are gods who are associated primarily with the sky. There's a god who's the sovereign of the universe, there's a lord of creatures, there's a protector of contracts, there's a fire god, and a god called Soma, who takes his name from a hallucinogenic drug, and scholars are still trying to figure out what that was. There's also Yama, who's the first man to die, and he later presides over the world of the dead. We don't see much in the Rigveda of the two major gods of later Hinduism, Shiva and Vishnu. Shiva appears in the Rigveda as Rudra, who is a turbulent god who needs to be appeased. And Vishnu also appears in this text as a dwarf who wins earth, air, and sky for the gods, and then consigns demons to the netherworld. The Indus civilization had lots of temples and lots of images, but the Aryans, as far as we can tell, didn't really have any. They had a religion of sacrifice that was based around the idea of a sacred fire. There was a cult of sacrifice, and we know that Aryans sacrificed grass, butter, milk, fruits, cereals, and sometimes meat to the gods. Does the Rigveda tell us anything about social life? Well, we do know that from the Rigveda that the Aryans were farmers and stock breeders. They had a relatively advanced chariot that they attached to an ox. They had horses, but they probably weren't used that much, mostly by the lower classes or those who needed to make really fast getaways. The chief form of wealth in this period was cattle. It was highly valued for draft, for meat, and for milk. The Aryans used a term for war, and that term was desire for cattle. Cattle were often sacrificed by the Aryan people in the sacrifice ritual. And it's really interesting to note that while cattle were sacred, their flesh is not taboo at all. The Rigveda does suggest to us that the Aryan people were very different from those who inhabited the Indus Valley civilization. They may well have been militaristic, wandering tribes, and they took slaves from the local population. But they also weren't true nomads. We know that they practiced some forms of agriculture and also animal husbandry. They definitely cultivated barley and probably wheat too, and they also had a crude form of plow that they used. But this all just begs the question, who are the Aryan people and where did they come from? Well, once again, like we talked about last time, we know from languages that the Aryans came from somewhere else. Probably not from South India, not from the East, but we think most likely from the west and northwest of India. We know that in part through the linguistic evidence that there was a Proto-Indo-European language. We can compare and contrast different languages around Eurasia and look at the cultures that came from it. This implies to us that there was a Proto-Indo-European culture that spread. And I want to be clear, this isn't a race, it's cultural practices, and it may have involved many different groups. But what do we know? We know that Indo-Aryans were cattle and horse herders. They had carts, they had chariots, they had some kind of agriculture, they lived in semi-permanent houses made of wood and thatch instead of tents. We know that they drank mead or fermented honey. They used stone, copper, and bronze, and they knew pottery weaving and carpentry. These are pretty advanced arts. They all had gods who they divided into 3 categories. They were responsible for magic and laws, gods responsible for military success, and then gods responsible for fertility. So if we had to guess about the origins of the Indo-Aryan people, we'd probably say that this culture developed somewhere in the steppes of southern Russia in the 3rd millennia BC. We found there burial mounds, the remains of sheep, cattle, and horses, chariots, clay models of wagons, implements of flint, bone, copper. This looks like good archaeological evidence for the Proto-Indo-European culture that we've identified through texts. So basically, at some point, Indo-Aryan speakers arrive in India, and we think that's sometime between 1500 and 1200 BCE. This sort of helps fill in our story from before. The Indus civilization dies out around 1900 before the Common Era, and then sometime between 400 to 700 years later, this new group migrates to India, and it forms Vedic or Aryan society. And Vedic society continues to develop through a series of cultural exchanges and maybe cultural battles. In Vedic society, we see that there's a priestly caste that becomes more and more important. This is a practice that spreads eastward. It moves towards the Delhi region between the Indus and the Ganges River, and it becomes the middle country of the Vedas, or the Brahminical religion. This culture spreads east to Bengal by around 500 BC, and it spreads southwest too to present-day Gujarat. And in Vedic civilization, the cult of sacrifice becomes more and more important. There's a holy sacrifice ceremony that moves to the center of Vedic or Aryan civilization. Some of the sacrifices that we read about in texts are so demanding that they probably were never actually performed. There's one sacrifice that takes 1,000 years to complete. There's another that needs 609 distinct animals, ranging from an elephant to a bee. There's another that requires a fire altar made of 10,800 bricks. This is the moment when we start seeing early Aryan or Vedic religion moving beyond the household and turning into the beginning of a religion. Vedic literature also begins to expand. It becomes more and more codified and complex. And so in later Vedic literature, we see distinct roles being laid out for priests and kings. There's something like an early Vedic science that begins to sprout up. There are rules for domestic ritual, there's rules for higher ritual, but there's also new secular disciplines. And in Vedic texts, we see the beginning of disciplines like phonetics, etymology, grammar, metrics, and even early astronomy. Alongside all this, we see the beginning of major social stratification. In the Vedic literature, we see 4 different groups described that we'll roughly describe as castes. There's Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. These translate roughly into priest, warrior, aristocrat, and Shudra, or the lowest form of caste. This latter category might have referred to artisans, but these are probably people who worked in agrarian occupations or different specializations in crafts. So if we zoom out a little bit, we begin to see some of the early features of Indian life that will look familiar to us as we think about later accounts of Hinduism. There's the idea in this later Vedic literature of rebirth, of caste, of social stratification, and then a regular ritualized practice of religious life that looks a little more modern. This is familiar to us, and we should begin to start drawing links between Vedic civilization, Indo-Aryan civilization, and later traditions on the Indian subcontinent. So let me move you a bit forward. I'm going to take you to around the year 500 before the Common Era. Alexander the Great has tried and ultimately failed to conquer India. He's scared off by war elephants, but he leaves behind a legacy of many Indo-Greek connections, maybe most notably in the world of philosophy. India in this period is a place of immense philosophical and religious sophistication. There's records, textual records of a tremendous amount of philosophical debates, major rivalries between schools, big conversations that are taking place in public. They occur in parks, in groves on the outskirts of cities, and famous philosophers are regularly holding court with the public. This is really different from the Vedic period in India, when philosophical debates were not held in public. They were limited to the private domain of the elite. And the presence of multiple competing ideologies became a staple feature of urban life in India at this period. And some of these different ideologies began to turn into sects. These sects that emerged were not necessarily bound by caste. Sometimes they grew into bigger orders. There were a lot of different philosophies. Again, this is a tremendously fertile intellectual period. But 2 philosophies last well beyond the others. The first is Jainism. Jain philosophies begin to take shape in the 6th century before the Common Era. Early Jains rejected the authority of the Vedas, and they were maybe even atheists at the beginning. They believed and continue to believe in the purification of the soul as the object of living. You don't get purity, according to Jainism, by knowledge. And there's the classic Jain tradition or the Jain story of 6 blind men touching an elephant and all seeing different things, a rope, a snake, a tree trunk, and so forth. This is a parable that suggests to us that every person only sees a fraction of true knowledge, and so knowledge itself isn't enough for salvation. And at the core of Jain ideology is an obsessive focus on nonviolence. Even the unconscious killing of an ant while walking becomes sinful, and more orthodox members of the Jain sect would wear a muslin mask to prevent the inhalation of insects. Nothing should be killed in Jainism or treated with violence, and this emphasis on nonviolence takes the term ahimsa. Ahimsa, or nonviolence, is the idea that prevents Jains from becoming agriculturalists, since doing that would require, of course, killing pests. And so this limits Jains in this early period, as in later periods, primarily to working in trade and commerce. And because there's a religious emphasis on frugality, the religion spreads quickly among trading communities. So it spreads and it becomes associated with urban culture. Jainism really is a product of South Asia's cities. At the same time that the Jain philosophies are developing, we also see the other tradition developing that will emanate out from South Asia, that of Buddhism. The Buddha, or the Enlightened One, comes from the Shakya clan, and his father is a Kshatriya. We know most of his story from fable, and some of it may be familiar to you. Buddha was born in the 6th century. He lived his young life as either a prince or an aristocrat. But then he steps outside the manor or the palace where he was raised, and he comes into contact for the first time with the sick, the suffering, and the dead. So one night, Buddha leaves his family, and he decides to become an ascetic. He renounces the material world around him. But after a long period of asceticism, of starving himself, of turning away from the material world, the Buddha realizes that this is no way to achieve freedom from rebirth. So he turns instead to meditation. And he hopes that in meditation, he can find the path forward to liberation. After 49 days of meditation, the Buddha achieves enlightenment, and he understands the cause of suffering in the world. Now, Buddha very quickly, like other philosophers of his day, begins to collect adherents. And he gives his first discourse or religious speech at the deer park in Sarnath, near modern-day Varanasi. He speaks to 5 disciples there, and he gives the discourse on the turning of the wheel of law. This is one of the foundational texts of Buddhism, and in it, the Buddha outlines the 4 noble truths. The world, he said, is full of suffering. He says that suffering, secondly, is caused by human desire. Thirdly, renunciation of that desire is the path to nirvana, or liberation from rebirth. But fourth, that renunciation can only be realized by an 8-fold path, which results in a balanced or moderate life. He says that someone who's going to become enlightened should hold right views, right resolves, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right recollection, and right meditation. And together, these become a central tenet of Buddhist philosophy, and they're known to most adherents as the middle way. The one thing that's pretty impressive about Buddhism is that it's a pretty simple religious tenet. You don't really need complex metaphysics to understand it, or complex rituals. You just need a commitment to ethical behavior. And so this is a philosophy that really turns away from caste identity, and it puts in its place a concern with the general welfare of humanity. It's a religious tradition that is pretty revolutionary when it begins to develop and emanate out of Southern Asia. It questions the authority of the Vedas, and it really throws aside or casts aspersions on a lot of rabbinical ritual. Things like the sacrifice of animals in this period become unacceptable to Buddhist adherents. Buddha is unoriginal, but he's also distilling a lot of the big philosophical concerns of the day. The doctrine of karma and samsara, which link action and rebirth, is essential to the Buddhist system, even though Buddha denied the existence of the soul. And he's responding in this moment to big social stratification in Vedic society. The Buddha is pretty egalitarian for his time. He has to be persuaded, but he eventually agrees to permit the ordaining of women as nuns, which is a real blow to the social order of the day. Buddha, in his lifetime, travels around the Ganges plains, and slowly monastic orders begin to form around him. These become known as the Sangha, or the Buddhist community. Near towns in South Asia, we begin to see monasteries and nunneries rising up, and so there's a lot of support that comes from the Indian lay community in this period. Buddhism, of course, spreads widely across Asia, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, across the world. After the Buddha's death, the Tripitaka, the Buddhist canon, becomes collected as oral tradition. But it only gets written down a couple of centuries later, and so it's very hard for us to see what the Buddha's actual teachings were versus those of his followers, and it's also hard to put dates on these thoughts. But the Buddhist canon travels widely. It's translated very quickly. It moves from Pali into Chinese and then into other languages, and it helps us understand some of the original intention of these texts. As it spreads across Asia, it moves in 2 major schools. There's first the Theravada tradition, the teaching of the elders, which goes to Burma, to Thailand, Laos, and Sri Lanka. And the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle tradition, is the one that goes to Tibet and then on to Nepal, China, Korea, and Japan. It's really important to note that while these religions of Jainism and Buddhism come out of Vedic society, they're distinct religions that are at odds with a lot of Brahminical ideas, and they're seen at the time and afterwards as really radical and antithetical to the social order of the day. Let's shift gears. We're going to be talking a lot in sessions ahead about the idea of empires. In colonial times, it was really clear to people what an empire was. It had extensive territory, monumental architecture, grandiose public works, imperial proclamations. The British in India, and we'll be talking a lot about them, believed that an empire was mostly characterized by agrarian revenue and land, with land owned by the state or with entitlements to the state. And this was a historical justification to the claim of the ownership of resources. We'll talk a lot about this in sessions to come. But an early empire is a little trickier to understand. We know that it's bigger than a state, and it comes out of the state structures that preceded it. An early empire has a differentiated economy, so it's not like kingdoms. There's an assumption of cultural uniformity, but we're not really sure how much that really is the case. There is monumental architecture, but maybe largely as a statement of power or presence. And the uniformity of laws is probably not as important as it is in later empires. But it's clear that however you define an empire, when we get to the Mauryans, this is a moment when we can really speak about empire in South Asia. We get to a point in time, this is the 3rd to the 1st century before the Common Era, where there's abundant textual historical record. We know that there's a major empire founded by Chandragupta Maurya, who succeeds the Nanda throne in 321 before the Common Era. We don't know much about his origins or his caste status, but we do know that Chandragupta is young. He gets to the throne, and then he moves to the northwest to exploit a power vacuum that's left in Alexander's wake. He begins to expand all over India, and he starts working with and training war elephants, or at least his military does. Chandragupta has a son, Bindusara, and that empire begins to expand. There's a Tibetan history of Buddhism that says that his son, Bindusara, is responsible for the conquest of the land between the two seas, and that's the Arabian Sea on one side and the Bay of Bengal on the other. He dies in 272 before the Common Era, and he has a son who you may have heard of, Ashoka. Now, archaeologists and historians used to think that Ashoka was just another Mauryan king. But in 1837, a British archaeologist discovered an inscription that was written in the Brahmi script, and it described a king who called himself the beloved of gods. And then another discovery really far away in 1925 of another edict also had a king calling himself by the same name, and it added his proper name, Ashoka. This was the evidence that archaeologists needed, and they put the two pieces together, and they began to discover inscriptions all across the Indian subcontinent. They later became known as the Minor and Major Rock Edicts. They're made out of polished sandstone pillars, they're big monoliths, and they're quarried out of the same stone. They're found along the Ganges River, and so we have a sense that they were dug out of a quarry, probably in Varanasi, and then shipped along the river and moved from there. The Ashokan edicts or pillars are mostly written in Brahmi, but sometimes they're written in other languages, like Greek or Aramaic. And so it's meant for people along the borders. This is an early border zone. And it becomes clear to archaeologists working in the early 20th century that the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka is in fact huge. Now we know something else about Ashoka too. He is perhaps the foremost proponent of Buddhism in early India. We're able to piece some of that story together through these rock edicts. There's a well-known story of how around 260 before the Common Era, Ashoka campaigned against a foreign group called the Kalingans. One of the major pillars, this is the Rock Edict 12, says, when he had been consecrated 8 years the beloved of gods, the king Piyadasi conquered Kalinga. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. Afterwards, now that Kalinga was annexed, the beloved of the gods very earnestly practiced Dhamma, desired Dhamma, and taught Dhamma. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of gods, and weighs heavily on his mind. So what's going on here? Ashoka launches a successful war campaign, but he apparently becomes sickened by the destruction that it causes, and he begins to turn to Buddhist teachings for comfort. Over 2.5 years, he becomes a devout Buddhist. He endorses nonviolence and forswears war, which is a strange thing for an emperor to do. Ashokan society is really sophisticated. We know that its emissaries communicated with places well beyond India. Ashoka sent diplomats to Greece, to Egypt, and further afield. We're not quite sure if he had connections with China, but there's good reason to think that he might. He had a great relationship with Sri Lanka in particular, and Ashoka sends his own son as a missionary to that island. The first 3 Mauryan emperors govern a gigantic, vast territory, and they express a political vision that's going to become very influential over later generations of Indian political life. There's visions of tolerance, and there's a lot of interest in commanding loyalty from alliances in the periphery rather than coercion from the center. That said, this was still a powerful empire that was able to threaten force. After Ashoka's death, the empire decentralized, and there were 5 centuries after of very fragmented polities across India. The subcontinent gets broken up, but it's still very prosperous. There's a big coastal trade, there's trade with the Roman Empire and Southeast Asia, and there's the quiet assertion of Indian cultural influence, often through Buddhism, in Thailand and Cambodia. Again, this is a moment when centralized power is built up and then declined. It's that theme that I mentioned at the beginning and that I'd like us all to keep in mind. We won't spend a whole lot of time on the next empire that took root on the Indian subcontinent. But it's worth mentioning that the small kingdoms that rise in the wake of Ashoka's death putter around for several centuries before a new Gupta empire is formed. In the 4th century of the Common Era, Chandragupta and Samudragupta incorporate 20 small kingdoms into a large overland empire across North India and the Deccan. The structure of this empire is a bit looser than the Mauryan Empire under Ashoka. There's not a ton of centralized control. Gupta leaders didn't really want to dominate the south of the subcontinent, but Sri Lanka and the Indo-Iranian borderlands came under the indirect influence of the empire. There was great political, social, and religious flexibility, a lot of economic prosperity, big agriculture, long-distance trade across the Arabian Sea, even as far as Rome and the Mediterranean world and to Southeast Asia. But maybe more importantly, under Chandragupta II, there are major cultural changes on the subcontinent that will endure for a long time. Some of these changes are conservative in nature. The Vedic rituals of an early era become more and more important. Horse sacrifice becomes an imperial spectacle, caste hierarchies become a lot more rigid under the Gupta Empire. There's social customs that begin to denigrate women in new ways, and the Vedas lose out in some ways in influence to documents like the Bhagavad Gita. But like other imperial leaders in South Asia, the Gupta leadership does remain fairly tolerant to others. Buddhism in particular continues to thrive under the Gupta Empire. But maybe the most lasting achievement of the Gupta Empire is that this is the period where what we think of as Hinduism today is really consolidated. This is the beginning of a tradition that has a polymorphic monotheism with 3 major cults. There's a cult of Shiva, of Vishnu or Krishna, and then the mother goddess of Durga or Kali. There's also major literary achievements in this period, and scientific ones too. Gupta-era scientists calculate the value of pi, the length of the solar year, and this is also the moment when the fine arts soar. The famous Ajanta caves were done in this period. But this isn't an empire that lasts very long. It begins to fade by the 6th century when the Huns begin to invade, and the empire's treasury is drained. There's an economic decline and major decentralization, and again, that consolidation and decline is one of our main themes for our time here today. So let's recap. Today, we've moved from the beginning of recorded history to the birth of civilization on the Indian subcontinent. We traced the architectural and archaeological records of Harappan civilization and the written records that give us some story of Indo-Aryan civilization and Vedic life. We outlined some of the cultural exchanges that led to new religious ideas on the subcontinent and the new radical traditions of Jainism and Buddhism. We traced some of the dynamics that structured India's two most important pre-modern empires, the Maurya Empire and the Gupta Empire, which followed. I've tried to suggest here how in South Asia there's often periods of centralization of power, ideas, money, and that they're just as often followed by periods of decentralization and occasionally decline. And there are moments when Indian actors are open to new ideas from beyond the subcontinent, and this is an idea we'll pick up the next time when we talk about the rise of Islam in South Asia and the birth of the Mughal Empire. Let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.